They say that true courage doesn't bark. It protects in silence. Welcome to Vale Marks, where stories are more than just tales. They are windows into the quiet power of love, loyalty, and second chances. What if the most feared creature in the neighborhood became its greatest guardian? What if a broken family was mended by the bond between a child, a wounded bird, and a battle-scarred dog? This is not just a story. It is a lesson, a journey, a quiet roar of hope. Watch until the very end, and if it touches you, subscribe to support this channel and help us reach 1,000 souls who believe in stories that heal. It was a snow-choked night in the quiet outskirts of Helena, Montana. The wind howled through the tall pine trees like a morning song, and white flurries danced beneath the pale glow of flickering street lamps. Houses stood still, lights dimmed early, as if the cold had lulled them all into silence. On Sycamore Lane, where the homes were modest and memories long, the snow buried more than just driveways. It buried stories people no longer dared to tell. At the end of the street sat a weathered blue house with a crooked mailbox and a rusted fence that had long forgotten its color. Inside lived Evan Holloway, a widowed father in his late 30s, and his daughter Lily, just 5 years old. Since her mother's death in a tragic car accident nearly a year ago, Lily had barely spoken. She drifted through her days like a ghost, always clutching a small red blanket, eyes wide with things no child her age should ever have to carry. On this particular night, as the clock inched past midnight, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the snow-packed road. Dressed in a heavy hooded coat and moving quickly but cautiously, they made their way to the fence of the Holloway home. In their gloved hands was a small, trembling creature, barely alive, barely breathing. It was a starling, its wing bent at an awkward angle, feathers clumped together from cold and fear. The person paused for a moment, glancing around as if haunted by the decision they were about to make. Then, with a movement that was both desperate and oddly gentle, they leaned over the fence and placed the bird just beyond the reach of the wind, in the dry corner beneath the porch. No note. No explanation. Just the fragile weight of a broken thing left behind. The figure turned and vanished into the snow, swallowed whole by the storm. Watching from the shadows of the yard was Kitten. Kitten was not the kind of dog one would approach with a treat and a smile. He was a pit bull, large and powerful, with a frame that bore the weight of things unseen. His coat was a charcoal gray, though years of weather and solitude had dulled its shine. Scars slashed across his flank and muzzle like war paint. But it was his eyes, deep amber and tired, that told the real story. Those who dared to look saw something ancient in them, something lost. Kitten had once served proudly as a K9 with a specialized military unit. His partner, Carl Monroe, was a decorated veteran who had saved lives both on and off the battlefield. Carl wasn't just Kitten's handler, he was his world. The two had been inseparable until Carl's heart failed him on a winter morning, not unlike this one. Since that day, Kitten had been passed from shelter to shelter, until Evan took him in on a recommendation from an old friend who swore Kitten needed a place to rest, not be caged. Kitten had taken to the porch and never left it. He rarely barked. He didn't play fetch. Children crossing the street would whisper rumors. Some said he once killed a wild wolf. Others believed he was part machine. To Evan, Kitten was quiet company. To Lily, he was a silent shadow, always there, always still. But that night, as the snow softened the sounds of the world, Kitten heard something, faint, fragile, and alive. A chirp, high and broken, slipping beneath the wind. His ears perked, not in aggression, but in recognition. It wasn't just the bird's sound. It was the quiet desperation in it that stirred him. Slowly, he rose from his spot beside the porch, joints creaking, muscles heavy from years of service and solitude. The snow clung to his back as he moved forward, one step at a time, toward the tiny bundle under the porch. The wind cut through the yard like a blade, and yet Titan's movements were deliberate, respectful. He stopped just short of the bird, the amber of his eyes catching the shimmer of moonlight. The starling shivered but didn't move. Titan stared, breath fogging the air between them, and for a moment the world seemed to still. And then something ancient awakened in him, not instinct, not duty, but memory. He saw Carl, standing in a muddy field, cradling a wounded pup in his arms. "You don't get to choose who you protect," Carl had said once, after Titan shielded a wounded enemy soldier during a raid. "Sometimes it chooses you." That memory, buried beneath years of commands and silence, rose like a tide. Titan lowered his massive head. He sniffed the bird gently, exhaling a warm breath that made the starling twitch. But the dog didn't flinch. Instead, he lay down in the snow, positioning his body so that the bird was blocked from the wind. Not touching, not threatening, just watching. Inside the house, behind a frost-covered window, Lily stood silently in her pajamas, her small hands pressed to the glass. She had heard the chirp, too. She saw Titan move, saw the strange little form nestled beneath the porch light, and for the first time in many months, her eyes lit with something other than sadness. In that frozen moment, across the barrier of glass and years and grief, something passed between the girl and the dog. Not words, not gestures. Just a look, one that spoke of wounds, of silence, and of the strange way broken things can find each other. Outside, the storm howled on, but beneath the porch of a quiet house in Montana, a starling trembled, a pit bull guarded, and the world began, ever so slightly, to shift. Titan took a step forward, the snow crunching under his heavy paws, his eyes locked on the trembling bundle beneath the porch. The injured starling barely moved, its small body shivering, feathers slick with melting snow. To Titan, it was prey, injured, weak, and unfamiliar. His instincts, trained through years of military obedience, told him to remove anything foreign from his space. No hesitation, no mercy. His lips curled slightly as a low growl vibrated deep in his chest. He crouched closer, muscles tensing as if preparing to lunge. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, the front door creaked open and a small figure darted into the cold. "Pepper!" Lily's voice broke through the still night like a fragile bell, her first spoken word in weeks. Barefoot in her fleece pajamas, Lily stumbled into the snow. The freezing air bit at her cheeks and tangled her wisps of golden brown hair, but she didn't care. Her eyes were locked on the injured bird. She dropped to her knees in the snow, cupping the starling gently in her trembling hands. Titan froze mid-step. His growl caught in his throat as he watched the child kneel just inches from the object he'd marked for removal. Her small arms curled around the bird, body hunched to protect it from the cold wind, and from him. She was shielding it. From him. His instincts screamed in confusion. She was tiny, this child. Barely 5, her limbs too thin for the winter air, her eyes too large for a world that had already hurt her. But her hands, they were steady. Delicate fingers cradled the wounded creature like it was made of glass. She looked up at him, their eyes met. In that instant, something fractured inside Titan. A splintering crack through years of discipline, commands, and silence. The memory rushed in, uninvited and vivid. Carl. Standing in a dusty courtyard somewhere far from here, Kitten had been a pup, newly trained, all clumsy paws and rigid drills. Carl had crouched beside him, ruffling the fur between his ears, his eyes soft despite the hardness of the world. "One day, boy," Carl had said, voice low and steady, "you'll find someone who needs you, not just to bark or bite, to protect. Really protect. You'll know when it's time." Kitten blinked, the past slipping into the present like snow melting into soil. He lowered his body slightly, not in submission, but in reconsideration. The child's scent filled his nose, vanilla shampoo, warmth, and sadness. A mix he'd come to recognize during the quiet nights on the porch when she sat at the window and watched the stars, always clutching that same red blanket. She never spoke, never laughed, just watched, like a ghost waiting for something to bring her back to life. And here she was, alive in the cold, holding something even more fragile than herself. Kitten let out another low growl, uncertain. He didn't understand what was happening inside him. The usual certainty, the sharp lines between threat and safety, had blurred. He circled slowly, eyes flicking between the child and the bird. Lily stayed still, her body trembling not from fear, but from cold. The wind picked up, blowing flakes into her face, and she squeezed the bird tighter, shielding it. Evan appeared at the door a second later, panic written across his face. "Lily!" he shouted, rushing into the snow without his coat. "What are you doing?" "Baby, it's freezing." Lily didn't answer. Her focus remained on Kitten. "Kitten, no!" Evan called, seeing the massive dog so close to his daughter. His voice cracked with fear, but Kitten didn't move forward. Instead, he stepped back just one pace, then lowered his head. Lily finally looked up at her father. "He's not going to hurt me," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but steady. "He's just scared." Evan stopped mid-step. Her words hit him harder than the wind. "She's speaking," he muttered to himself, barely believing it. Tears welled in his eyes as he moved closer, wrapping his coat around her and gently lifting her and the bird into his arms. Lily didn't protest. She simply looked back at Kitten as Evan carried her inside. Kitten stood there for a long moment, snow coating his back like dust on an old monument. His breath came slow and steady, curling in the air like smoke from a forgotten fire. Something inside him stirred, an ache that wasn't physical. It wasn't about the bird, it wasn't about instinct, it was about her. Back in the warmth of the house, Lily sat near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket. The starling rested in a shoebox lined with tissues and flannel, unmoving but alive. Evan knelt beside her, overwhelmed, unsure whether to ask about the bird, the dog, or her voice. Instead, he simply said, "Tell me about him." Lily looked toward the window, where Kitten still sat in the snow, watching silently. "He's sad," she said softly. "Just like me." And outside, as the snow finally began to slow, Kitten lifted his head toward the light, listening, not for orders, not for threats, but for something else. A beginning. The morning after the snowstorm was quiet, wrapped in the soft glow of winter sun. It filtered through frost-laced windows, casting silver light onto the wooden floors of the Holloway home. The fire in the living room crackled gently, and a subtle warmth crept through the walls as the heater hummed to life. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel cold, not entirely anyway. Evan Holloway stirred his coffee absently, watching his daughter from across the room. Lily sat cross-legged on a cushion near the fire, her eyes fixed on the shoebox in front of her. Inside, nestled in the folds of a flannel kitchen towel, was the little starling. The bird's chest rose and fell slowly, still too weak to move much, but its eyes fluttered open with every pop from the fireplace. Kitten lay nearby, his chin resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Evan had not intended to let the bird stay. In fact, his first reaction had been firm. Wild animals didn't belong in the house. But something about the way Lily had looked at him, her first words spoken in nearly 5 months, her arms wrapped protectively around that broken bird, had unraveled him. And then she'd smiled. Not a full laugh, not yet, but a tiny curve at the corner of her mouth. It had been so long since Evan had seen anything resembling light in her face that he didn't have the heart to say no. So the bird stayed. They named it Pepper. It had been the name Lily's mother, Sarah, once gave to a pet bird when she was a girl. Lily had heard the story dozens of times, usually told in Sarah's warm voice while folding laundry or brushing her daughter's hair. That name, whispered gently into the silence of the living room, felt like a thread tying the past to the present, a reminder of who they were before the world cracked open. In the days that followed, the house began to change. Not drastically, not all at once, but in subtle, lingering ways. Kitten, for one, seemed baffled. The bird was no longer a target. Somehow it had been promoted to house guest, and more confusing still, it was allowed to perch on the edge of his dog bed, sometimes even hopping onto his back. The first time it happened, Kitten stood frozen, muscles stiff, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. He looked at Evan, then at Lily, waiting for someone to tell him this was against the rules. But none came. Instead, Lily giggled, a soft musical sound that made Kitten's ears twitch. She started lying beside him at night, sometimes falling asleep with her cheek resting against his side. The first time it happened, Kitten stayed rigid for nearly an hour, unsure of what to do. The warmth of her small body against his was unlike anything he'd known. It wasn't command or routine or duty. It was comfort. Unfamiliar, yes, but not unwelcome. He remembered something Carl used to do after long patrols. How the old man would sit down on the steps and lean against Kitten, humming old songs under his breath, running a calloused hand over the dog's back. Those moments were quiet, but they anchored Kitten in ways no training ever could. And now, here was this child, broken in a way Kitten understood deeply, choosing him as her anchor. Even Evan noticed the change. Lily was still quiet, but not absent. She began helping feed Pepper, measuring out seeds and water each morning. She would whisper to the bird when she thought no one was listening, telling it about her dreams, about her mother, about Kitten. Sometimes she would sit on the rug beside her father, leaning her head against his arm, a closeness they hadn't shared since the funeral. Evan wasn't immune to the shift either. He found himself lingering longer in the living room, watching the three of them, the dog, the bird, and the little girl, as they settled into routines that felt oddly natural. It was as though the chaos of the outside world had paused at their doorstep. There, inside those 4 walls, time moved more gently. Kitten, too, was learning. He no longer barked at the sound of the mail truck or paced when unfamiliar footsteps passed the house. His muscles remained taut, always ready, but his eyes had softened. He watched Lily with the protectiveness of a soldier guarding a queen. If she cried in her sleep, he would nose her blanket back over her shoulders. If she laughed, he would tilt his head, as if trying to understand the sound that had been missing for so long. And Pepper, ever the silent observer, began to grow stronger. Its wing, once twisted, now stretched more confidently. It fluttered from the back of the couch to the windowsill, and sometimes even onto Kitten's back again, where it would rest like a tiny crown. The dog never flinched. If anything, he seemed to expect it. Evan watched all this unfold with quiet awe. He had adopted Kitten reluctantly, more out of obligation to a fallen friend than any real desire for companionship. But now, he saw something he hadn't expected. A bond that wasn't just practical, but emotional. Kitten wasn't simply filling space. He was healing something. In Lily, in himself, perhaps even in that tiny bird. Late one evening, Evan stepped outside for firewood. When he returned, he paused at the doorway. Lily lay curled beside Kitten, fast asleep, her hand resting gently on the dog's paw. Pepper was perched on the arm of the couch, head tucked under a wing. The room glowed with firelight, and for a moment, Evan stood frozen, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of the scene. He didn't dare move. He didn't want to disturb it. 3 lives, each one fractured in different ways, had somehow found one another. They weren't whole yet. But they were trying, together. And for the first time since Sarah's passing, Evan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd be okay. Spring came slowly to Montana. The snow melted in patches, revealing yellowed grass and rain-soaked earth beneath. Icicles that had clung to rooftops like jagged teeth began to drip and disappear. Inside the Holloway house, warmth returned, not just from the change in weather, but from something deeper, something alive. Lily was laughing more. Pepper had begun flying short laps across the living room. And Kitten, though still quiet and cautious, now spent his days lying not just outside, but sometimes inside, near the fire, resting his head on Lily's lap. But peace, as Evan knew too well, was never permanent. It started with a note. Folded and tucked under the windshield wiper of Evan's truck, the paper was simple and unsigned. "That dog is dangerous. Someone's going to get hurt." The handwriting was shaky, rushed, maybe even angry. Evan stared at it for a long moment, then crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash. But the message clung to him. Later that week, a neighbor named Fred McAllister, who lived 2 houses down and always walked with a permanent scowl, approached Evan as he was taking out the trash. "You know, pit bulls turn on people all the time," Fred said, crossing his arms. "Especially the ones trained for combat. That dog could snap any minute. What happens if it's your kid next?" Evan didn't answer. He just stared, holding the trash lid open until Fred huffed and walked away. But the words had done their damage. By the end of the month, there were whispers around the block. One family said they'd seen Kitten staring too long at their toddler. Another swore he growled at a jogger. No one ever said anything directly to Evan after that first encounter. But the tension grew, thick and quiet like a storm cloud rolling in. It hurt more than Evan expected. Not because he was being targeted, but because Kitten, this dog who had become more guardian than pet, was being judged by scars he hadn't chosen. The final blow came during a weekend meeting of the neighborhood association. Only a handful of residents showed up, but the topic had clearly been passed around behind closed doors. Fred stood again, bold and loud. "Look, I know some of you think that dog is sweet. Maybe he is, until he's not. I've seen what pit bulls can do. One minute they're quiet, the next they're clamping down on someone's arm. You want to take that risk around our kids? Around our grandkids?" Some people murmured in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. Evan stood at the edge of the group, hands clenched. Then a voice broke through the noise. "I train dogs like him," said Mrs. Clarkson, heads turned. The 78-year-old woman stood slowly from her metal chair, her gray coat buttoned all the way up to her chin. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, and somehow it silenced the crowd more effectively than any shout could. "I was a field nurse in Vietnam. Worked alongside canine handlers. Saw the things those dogs did, the things they sacrificed. And I'll tell you something about that pit bull. Kitten, is it? Evan nodded slowly. I've seen that look in a dog's eyes before, she continued. Not rage. Not madness. Grief. I've seen it in the eyes of a shepherd who lost his partner to a landmine. I've seen it in a lab mix who carried wounded soldiers through the jungle. It's not violence you're seeing in that dog. It's mourning. Fred scoffed. You're telling me that dog's sad? No, Mrs. Clarkson replied, unblinking. I'm telling you he's waiting. For a reason to believe again. The words hung in the air like smoke. That night, Evan thanked her as she walked home. She only nodded. That dog doesn't need protection, Mr. Holloway. Your daughter does, and I think maybe they're protecting each other. But even as neighbors quieted down after the meeting, something inside Kitten began to unravel. The dreams returned first. They were more like flashes than full dreams, explosions echoing across empty alleys, shouts in languages he didn't recognize, Carl's voice calling his name and then falling silent. In sleep, Kitten would twitch and whimper, sometimes waking with a sharp bark that echoed through the house. Lily, half asleep, would reach out and place her hand gently on his head. It calmed him more than she would ever understand. During the days, Kitten grew more alert, more restless. He paced the yard like an old soldier on patrol, eyes scanning trees and fences. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was coming. Evan noticed the change and worried. He checked the locks more often, walked the perimeter of the fence, and moved Lily's bed farther from the window. Pepper, ever the quiet presence, became the odd constant in Kitten's day. The bird would land softly on his back as he sat outside. And sometimes, when Kitten trembled in his sleep, Pepper would nestle against his neck, soft feathers brushing the scars no one could see. Inside that house, 3 lives were still healing, each in their own way. Kitten from the wars of men. Lily from the war that grief had waged inside her, and Evan from the battle of trying to hold it all together. And in this uneasy peace, even the smallest threat, whether whispered gossip or buried memory, could shake their fragile balance. But they held on, together, because sometimes trust isn't about what's proven. It's about what's shared, a glance, a touch. A moment in the dark when someone chooses to stay beside you, even if they don't understand why. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, just as the first crocuses began to bloom along the fence line. The air was crisp, the sky a clear pale blue, and everything about the day felt ordinary, until it wasn't. Pepper was gone. No one noticed it at first. The starling had grown stronger over the past few weeks, testing its wings more often, fluttering from couch to windowsill, from the porch to the back fence. It had become a fixture in the Holloway home, a flicker of movement, a subtle reminder that healing wasn't always loud. Lily loved to hum when Pepper flew, and even Kitten had stopped reacting, simply turning his head as if to say, "You're safe, you belong." But that afternoon, after Lily returned from preschool, the bird was nowhere to be found. She searched the house once, twice, then a third time, calling out in her tiny voice, "Pepper! Pepper, where are you?" Her words, still soft from months of silence, began to crack. Evan joined the search, checking beneath cushions, behind curtains, in closets and under beds. But deep down, they both knew Pepper had flown beyond the walls. When Evan opened the back door, the screen creaked and caught in the wind. Outside, the feeder was untouched. The bird bath shimmered with clean water. No sign of feathers. No sign of struggle. Just absence. Lily's face turned pale. "What if something happened?" she whispered, her bottom lip trembling. Kitten, who had been lounging in the corner, perked up instantly. He sniffed the air, ears alert, and trotted to the porch. Evan watched as the old pit bull lowered his nose to the wooden floorboards, moving carefully along the scent trail. For nearly an hour, Kitten tracked across the backyard. down the slope behind the fence, past the tall grass at the edge of the woods. But he returned with nothing. His eyes, once sharp with the focus of a trained guardian, looked almost ashamed. Lily met him at the porch steps, her hands clenched into fists. "You were supposed to protect her," she whispered. Kitten didn't growl. He didn't move. That night, no one really ate dinner. Lily pushed her plate away without touching it, retreating to her room with the shoebox where Pepper used to sleep. She tucked it under her blanket like a pillow and lay facing the wall, her back to the door. Silent tears stained her cheeks. Evan tried to console her, but the grief she carried now had a familiar weight, one he remembered from the funeral. He knew better than to offer empty comfort. In the living room, Kitten remained curled by the door, staring out into the darkness as if waiting. His food bowl sat untouched. Not even a drop of water had left his dish. When Evan checked on him, Kitten simply looked up, then laid his head back down without a sound. Hours passed. The house grew quiet, except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional shift of the wind outside. Evan stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on the edge of the couch, watching Kitten with a kind of disbelief. This wasn't the same dog he had brought home out of obligation. This wasn't just an animal. Kitten had become something else entirely. He got up slowly and walked over, kneeling beside the pit bull. "You miss her too, don't you?" he said softly, brushing a hand over Kitten's scarred shoulder. Kitten didn't flinch. He just blinked once and gave a soft huff through his nose. In that moment, Evan saw it clearly. This wasn't just a pet reacting to routine. Kitten was mourning. He understood the absence. He carried the weight of it just as much as Lily did. And Evan, who had spent so much of the last year feeling like the only adult in a house held together by loss, suddenly didn't feel alone. Later that night, Evan walked past Lily's room and paused. The door was cracked slightly, and through it, he could hear her sobbing in that quiet, hiccuping way children cry when they think no one's listening. He stood there for a moment, torn. Then he opened the door. Kitten followed, unprompted, padding across the room and lying down beside the bed. Lily didn't say anything, but her arm reached out slowly, fingers brushing against Kitten's thick neck. "I didn't mean it," she whispered. Kitten gave a gentle grunt and leaned in. Evan sat at the edge of the bed, running a hand over Lily's blanket. "Sometimes things leave," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't mean they didn't love us." Lily turned toward him, eyes glistening. "Will she come back?" "I don't know," he admitted, his throat tight. "But if she can, she will." They sat in silence for a while, just the three of them, man, girl, dog, curled together in shared loss. The room no longer felt like a child's bedroom. It felt like a sanctuary, a space for broken things to rest. In the days that followed, they continued to hope. Evan set out birdseed every morning. Lily drew pictures of Pepper and taped them to the windows. Kitten watched the skies more often, ears flicking at every flutter, every chirp. They didn't talk about it much, but the absence was always there. An invisible seat at their table, a silence at the window. Yet somehow it felt different from the grief that had once consumed them. Because now, they had each other. They had learned that loss didn't mean being alone, that missing someone could bring people closer. And that even when something fragile takes flight, it leaves behind traces, memories that flutter and land, over and over, in the places it once called home. The snow had returned without warning. By dusk, the sky was a curtain of gray, and by nightfall, flakes were falling thick and fast, blanketing Sycamore Lane in white. The world outside the Holloway home grew hushed, as though it were holding its breath. Inside, the fireplace glowed softly, casting amber light across the living room, where Evan sat reading the newspaper, occasionally glancing toward Lily's closed bedroom door. It had been nearly a week since Pepper disappeared. Lily hadn't spoken much in days. She no longer drew, no longer played music on her small keyboard, and she barely touched her food. Kitten followed her everywhere, as if sensing the heaviness in her heart. He would sit beside her bed until she fell asleep, then return to the living room to rest by the fire. His ears always alert, always listening. At 11 that night, Evan stood to check the back door before bed. The wind whistled as he locked it, and something gnawed at his nerves. He glanced into Lily's room. Empty. His heart dropped. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the basement stairs. Nothing. Then he saw the front door. The deadbolt was still engaged, but the latch was unhooked. Cold air curled in from the crack near the floor. "Lily!" he shouted, his voice sharp with panic. He threw on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and burst outside, the snow stinging his face as he scanned the yard. That's when Kitten bolted. From where he lay, the pit bull suddenly sprang up, ears pricked forward. He sniffed the air once, twice, then let out a guttural bark before racing toward the backyard. Evan followed, stumbling in the drifts. Across the field behind their house, the flashlight beam caught something. Tiny footprints in the snow, weaving unsteadily across the ground and down the slope toward the old drainage ditch. "Lily!" Evan screamed again, slipping as he tried to run faster. Then came the sound that froze him mid-step, a scream, high-pitched. Desperate, then silence. Without hesitation, Kitten reached the edge of the ditch and leapt. The drop wasn't far, but the bank was steep and the bottom had collected water from melted snow and frozen rain. A sheet of thin ice covered most of the surface, and it had cracked open near the center where Lily had fallen. The child's body thrashed weakly in the frigid water, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her small hands reached for the ledge, but it was slick and crumbling. Her coat had weighed her down, and the icy current dragged her toward the culvert. Kitten landed hard on the ice. The surface cracked beneath his weight, but he kept going. Evan watched in disbelief as the dog moved like a soldier in a mission, every stride driven, every movement precise. Kitten lunged into the water, breaking through the rest of the ice, and paddled hard toward the sinking child. Lily's eyes widened when she saw him. "Kitten," she whispered, her lips blue. He reached her just as she slipped beneath the surface. Clamping his jaws gently onto her coat collar, he pulled, his body twisting with the effort. The water bit at his wounds, old scars that reopened with the cold, joints that had long since stiffened, but he didn't stop. With one final burst of strength, Kitten heaved Lily toward the bank, where Evan had slid down and was now reaching desperately. Evan grabbed her arms, pulled her up and wrapped her in his coat. She was shivering violently but conscious. Then he turned back toward the ditch. "Kitten?" he called. The dog struggled to climb out, his hind leg trembling, blood mixing with slush near his shoulder. Evan jumped down, waded in, and with a grunt, hoisted the dog's heavy body up onto the snow. Kitten collapsed beside Lily, panting, his chest rising in sharp, shallow breaths. And then, a flutter of wings. Evan looked up. From the dark sky, cutting through the falling snow like a miracle, came a flash of black and white. Pepper. The little bird swooped low and landed delicately on Evan's shoulder, chirping once before hopping down to perch beside Lily. She blinked in disbelief, her lips parting as she reached out. "Pepper?" she whispered. The bird chirped again and nestled into her palm. Evan stared at the scene in awe. The girl, the dog, the bird, together again in the snow, beaten but alive. His chest tightened with the weight of gratitude and something greater, wonder. Behind them, lights flicked on in the surrounding houses. One neighbor, alerted by the scream and the chaos, had captured it all from her second-story window. The child's fall, the dog's leap, the frantic rescue. The video was already being uploaded. By morning, it would be everywhere. But none of that mattered yet. Evan carried Lily into the house, wrapped in blankets. He dried Kitten as best he could, laying him near the fire. The dog winced when Evan touched his shoulder, but didn't move otherwise. Lily sat beside him, whispering softly to both Kitten and Pepper, her small hands stroking fur and feathers with care. "You saved me," she told Kitten, her voice hoarse but steady. The pit bull blinked, then leaned his head gently into her lap. Evan watched from the doorway, his heart full. The old promise Carl had made, the one about Kitten finding someone who needed him, had come true. Not just in words, but in action, in devotion, in instinct stronger than fear. And outside, as the snow began to lighten, the stars blinked awake. In a town that once doubted him, Kitten had become a hero, not for fighting, but for loving fiercely, and for remembering that even the most wounded souls can still save. In the days that followed the rescue, the story of Kitten spread like wildfire. The neighbor's grainy cell phone video, taken from a second-story window, showed everything. The storm, the fall, the desperate scramble through the snow, and the pit bull leaping into the freezing ditch to pull a little girl to safety. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the footage had already been shared hundreds of times across local pages and parenting forums. By the end of the week, it reached news outlets across the state. Hero dog saves child during snowstorm. Veteran K9 protects his family. From feared to fierce protector. Kitten's redemption. The headlines varied, but the heart of the story was the same. A misunderstood dog had defied every expectation, every stereotype, and had proven that loyalty wasn't about breed. It was about heart. And the town noticed. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the Holloway home now knocked on the door with baked goods, thank you cards, and treats for Kitten. One man brought handmade mittens for Lily. A woman knitted a custom blanket for the dog, embroidered with the words, "Thank you for being brave." Children left drawings of Kitten on the fence, taped with crooked hearts and misspelled notes like, "You're my hero, doggy." Even Fred McAllister, the grumpy man who had once led the calls for Kitten's removal, showed up on the porch one afternoon, hat in hand. He didn't say much, just muttered an awkward, "Thank you," then patted Kitten's head before walking off. It was a small gesture, but it said more than words ever could. Inside the home, the transformation was even more profound. Lily, once a quiet shadow of a child, had begun to speak freely. Her voice still carried a soft tremble, but she used it now, to ask questions, to sing little songs, to tell Pepper stories, and to talk to Kitten about her day. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep became fewer, and laughter, real, joyful laughter, returned to her eyes. And Kitten changed too. The haunted look in his eyes softened. The stiffness in his posture eased. His sleep became restful, no longer disturbed by memories of war or loss. He spent his mornings following Lily from room to room, occasionally glancing out the window but always circling back to her. At night, he lay near her bed like a silent guardian, not out of duty, but out of choice. The bond between them had become something sacred. He was her protector, yes, but also her friend, her confidant. She brushed his fur, whispered secrets into his ear, and sometimes lay beside him on the living room rug, her tiny fingers tracing the scars along his back with reverence, not fear. And every morning, like clockwork, Pepper returned. The little bird, once wounded and frail, had found its rhythm again. It would flutter through the kitchen window, Evan now left cracked open, perch on the windowsill, and sing. Not just chirps, but clear, bright trills that filled the house with something magical. Music. Not the kind that came from instruments or speakers, but the kind that came from healing, slow, delicate, and real. Evan often watched all of this with quiet amazement. He had adopted Kitten out of obligation. He had allowed Lily to keep Pepper out of guilt. He had carried his own grief silently, afraid to let it show. But now, he was part of something bigger than mourning. A family. So, one late spring afternoon, Evan made it official. He knelt beside Kitten in the yard, the grass finally green beneath their feet, and ran a hand gently over the dog's broad head. "You're not a guest here anymore," he said. "You're home." Kitten looked up, eyes calm and steady, as if he already knew. That evening, Evan signed the final adoption papers from the veteran K9 program, making Kitten a permanent member of the Holloway household. There was no ceremony, no applause, just the quiet click of a pen and the weight of something deeply right falling into place. The house that had once echoed with silence and sorrow was now full of small, beautiful sounds, the soft patter of paws, the flutter of wings, the giggle of a little girl, and the warmth of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. And in that stillness, the past was not erased, but honored. Sarah's photo still sat on the mantel. Carl's name remained stitched inside Kitten's service vest. Their memory was woven into the very fabric of this healing. On one especially calm evening, as golden light spilled across the porch and fireflies began to blink into the yard, Kitten lay stretched out beneath the eaves. His body, once taut with vigilance, now rested easily. Lily curled against his side, her hand on his back, her eyes watching the dusky sky. Pepper circled overhead, swooping and gliding, before finally landing gently on the railing near them. It was a quiet moment. No cameras, no applause, no news vans or social media. Just a dog, a girl, and a bird. 3 souls once broken, now stitched together by something stronger than grief. A home mended not with perfect parts, but with love, trust, and the willingness to stay. And in that final image, Kitten's steady breath, Lily's peaceful gaze, and Pepper's wings catching the last rays of the sun, there was no need for words. Only the quiet, undeniable truth that love, in its purest form, had made them whole. As the snow melts and the scars of the past fade into memory, one truth remains. Not all heroes wear capes. Some have paws, feathers, and tiny hands that reach out in trust. Here at Vale Marks, we believe stories like this carry echoes of the wisdom our grandparents whispered. Sometimes, broken hearts are the ones that know best how to protect. If this story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and please subscribe. Every click brings us closer to our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world. It is the light that helps us create more meaningful, heartfelt videos. Because the world needs more stories that don't just entertain, but gently, powerfully change us.